Fellow for the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. I'm doing a lot of communications and event planning work. So thank you all for bearing with me as I've sent you many emails about the webinars, and I'm so glad that you can join us. I'm so fortunate to have worked through this process with Tegan Engel, who works for the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale and consults for the Center for Environmental Justice. And this toolkit and this webinar series would not have been made possible without her. So thank you so much, Tegan. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Professor Gerald Torres, who will be introducing the center and the webinar today.
I want to welcome all of you and thank you for being here today for our webinar on using Landback as a tool for land justice. I want to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about the Yale Center for Environmental Justice, at least identify the panelists, and then talk a little bit about the toolkit. So I'm Gerald Torres. I'm the Dolores Huerta Wilma Mankiller Professor of Environmental Justice at the Yale School of Environment and the Yale Law School. I'm the founder of the Yale Center for Environmental Justice, which has been around since just recently, basically right before the pandemic. But what we're aiming to do is to reach across disciplines, across commitments, across communities, to center the idea of justice when we think about doing environmental work or natural resource work or land-based work at all, and to bring that vision into the curriculum and focus of the Yale School of the Environment more broadly. So I'm honored to host the wonderful speakers. I want to first introduce Chuck Sams, who is the newest faculty member of the Yale Center for Environmental Justice, and he is the Director of Indigenous Programs for the Center. One thing I will say that I think marks the center out from other centers for environmental justice around the country is we do have a strong focus on Native and Indigenous issues. And we want to bring those issues and integrate them into the center of environmental justice concerns. The other panelists who Chuck will introduce more fully are Elaine Harvey from the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, Dr. Tamiko Jackson McArthur, who's a pediatrician here in New Haven, and Peter Forbes, who is First Light and New Learning's journey. I will leave it to Chuck to explore more of that. I want to thank our co-sponsors for this webinar, but also for the toolkit that we prepared. The Aspetuck Land Trust has been integral right from the very beginning, and they understood clearly the way in which land trusts ought to be thinking about land back and land justice as part of their commitments. And the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, they've been steadfast partners of ours from the very beginning. So I don't know if Zoe is going to put the slide on the screen. But what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about the land tool, land trust and justice and land trust toolkit. It's actually the result of a 3-year project working with the Aspetuck Land Trust as our first community partner to support land trust to understand and identify a spectrum of tools that they can use to support land justice work. The toolkit is designed to be used by land trusts, but also by individuals, community groups, farmers, and other not immediately land-based organizations. The 9 tools covered in the guide are on, I don't know, it should be in a slide that you will see. And each section explains the tools and gives links to organizations and resources to help you learn more as ways to integrate these practices or implement them or to change them as necessary for your immediate and local concerns. So let me give you a little bit of background on Landback and land ownership. One of the things when you start to just investigate things like land trusts, just to choose one example, what you discover is, say, for a state like Connecticut, there are more land trusts than there are townships in Connecticut. Second, that land trusts control more territory than the state of Idaho in the United States. So they operate as one of the largest land managers in many ways, and almost a separate branch of land governance in the United States. When we think about land back, one of the questions that has certainly arisen in the context of indigenous and native work is the recognition of the importance of land to these communities historically. And we've seen efforts by various tribes and tribal nations around this country to work directly on land back. And you note that there's been much cooperation, both in the West and here in New England, between land trusts and people. So that the idea of repairing relationships that were born out of the way in which land has come in the ownership patterns it currently is are require deep inquiry, and reparations and rematriation are a step in the process of understanding what land justice means, but they're only just one step. And what the toolkit that we're going to go over today permits us to do is to dive more deeply into the underlying questions behind the issues of land back and land justice. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck, and then I will take my leave. Thank you for giving me this time, and thank you all for coming to this webinar and participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Torres. Nichala aninanyuma. Inashal inashashishkalashkuit iwa kanashnak niwi luma tichamna nichawipum. Good day, my friends and relatives. My Indian name is Mockingbird with Big Heart, but my given name is Chuck Sams, and I'm coming from the place of the Big Springs, which is the homelands of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla people in Northeast Oregon. And I'm so very pleased to be with you all today and pleased to join Yale Center for Environmental Justice as their Indigenous Programs Director. I was very excited when Tegan asked me to join you all to talk about land justice and land back and how these tools can be used. Many of the tools that have been developed around usage by the land trust movement are based, of course, on a Western legal model and do not necessarily always take into account what tribes have been doing since time immemorial. I've had the good fortune of working with land trusts across the United States and working with over 200 different tribes on land back issues. When I was working with the Trust for Public Land, where Peter also had worked for many years, we'd worked together on a number of issues, working with tribes to help them understand how to use these Western tools in order to meet their needs to have their land returned back to them. And many of these tools don't necessarily always fit within the traditional model of their own laws and understanding and relationship to land. I say that in that many times in my travels, I've seen where tribes have an understanding of their own laws. Among my own people, the law tells me, and we call that Tamunwit, tells me that I am made of the land, that my eyesight comes from eagle, my skin comes from elk, that my hearing comes from owl, that my nervous system comes from the plants. And therefore, for these gifts that I received off of the land, that I must be a good steward of those. Tribes for at least 30,000 years have stewarded the landscape of what we now know as North and South America. And these tools don't always necessarily address all the aspects of what that stewardship means and what is less transactional and more relational. When we were looking about who to invite, I was so very excited to have these particular folks coming to us. Tamiko Jackson McArthur and her work with her tribes to figure out how they're going to work on land. The East Coast was devastated very early on by colonialism and the taking of land. It's also where this myth began that there was a misunderstanding that tribal people didn't understand what land ownership is. In some of my very early work among with Eastern tribes, especially the Wampanoag and the Narragansett, saw some of the very first land leases that were signed by the English with the tribes. I also saw the very first signs of misogyny because the English wouldn't accept the markings of the women who actually owned the land of the tribes because they were matrilineal. And so there was a very clear understanding of land ownership. Then instead, there's a perpetuation that it was only communal and that there wasn't individual ownership, when in fact, some tribes did have individual ownership. I'm excited that Elaine Harvey is here for Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, but also from the Yakama Nation, one of my cousin tribes who understands the importance of the protection of the Columbia River system, the importance of salmon and what it means to us in the centralized responsibilities of Waikanishnak the keepers of the salmon, and what we do because salmon gave us of our voice completely so that we have this common language among the Sahaptin speaking people. But more importantly, her work and her life's dedication to protecting flora and fauna, to ensuring that we uphold the promise that we made here in the Pacific Northwest, and using the tools available while teaching also at the same time through the Columbia Land Trust what it means to have a reciprocating relationship with the land. And then finally, Peter Forbes. I've had the great fortune of being a partner with Peter Forbes on a number of projects across the United States, particularly his work that he's doing First Light in Maine and working with the tribes in Maine and the Land Trust and bridging what had been a very huge gap of understanding of what it means to be land stewards from both a native and a non-native concepts and realizing they really weren't that far apart. It's just the language and understanding between two different cultures. Peter and I have worked on the ideals of what it means to be a human again, what it means to be actually a person who comes forward and wants to be and do good, and to understand that we were born to be good, that we were born to do right, not to do wrong. So, with that, we're going to start off with a couple questions, and then I'm going to have each of these panelists talk about the work that they're doing out in the field, talk about the successes and challenges that they've faced in using some of the tools that are in this toolkit. What are the things that are working well? What are the things that are not working so well? What we've learned from that, and where we can improve upon it. Because as this has been laid out in Tegan's work in doing this, it has been a work in progress and will continue to be work in progress as all laws are, because laws can change from time to time and we can improve upon those laws. So I'm going to start out with the question that I wanted to ask all panelists, which is around the idea of land back can be defined as restoring indigenous sovereignty, kinship systems, and ancestral connections, such as stewardship. What does it mean to you and the work that you do? If I could start with Dr. Tamiko Jackson McArthur, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with so many people with so much knowledge with this work. My experience in this work is kind of being a recipient of the rematriation of lands belonging to my people. My tribal council has worked very hard in our rematriation that we have. We recently got 500 acres in Sutherland, Mass from the W.D. Cowles Land Trust. And in finally hearing that happened, it was almost like it was an exhalation, but then the real work starts, because we're going to make sure that we steward the land in a way that benefits all of the people of our nation. So that's where we are right now, with deciding what's going to go where, who's going to do what. One of the hardest things, though, in this journey was in acquiring it. It's not very easy to give land back to sovereign indigenous governments, because a lot of people don't know how to do it. If you're not a federally recognized tribe where the federal government, puts your land in a trust, you're out here saying, okay, well, how are we going to do it? As a state recognized tribe, you have to figure out, okay, so who's holding our land in trust? How do we do that? And a lot of people don't really get it because you can't give land back to Tamiko Caring Hands because I'm not a government, right? You just can't say, oh, you're indigenous, here's some land. That's not how it works. And a lot of people are working to figure this out, like this toolkit, which I think is there's no value you could put on that because it's worth so much. We need things that are going to walk us down the path of doing this the right way so that I always say, let people take it seriously. One thing that you said, Chuck, as far as Eastern Woodland tribes, I'm a Northeastern Woodland tribe. We were the first contact, so we were the first to be decimated. We were the first to be mixed with other cultures. So as the government or as colonization happened, they started throwing out all these like visions of Indians from West on a horse with a whole war bonnet and stuff like that. They don't. So you run into people with those type of stereotypes, and then that carries on to how they react to us when we're talking about our homelands. Which for us, it's Northeast Connecticut, Northwest Rhode Island, Connecticut River Valley, Central Massachusetts, thousands and thousands of acres. And some people can't believe when they look at me, well, you're indigenous? What do you mean you're indigenous? You just look like a Black woman. Like, you know what I'm saying? So it's very important to have discussions like this so that when we start using this toolkit or anything that you're doing to rematriate the land, that it's done the right way. And we need all hands on deck. And so I'm glad that I'm here. I hope that I made sense.
Thank you. Peter?
Thank you, Chuck. I got to say from the beginning, it's just such an honor to be on this panel with Tamiko and you, Chuck, Elaine. There's so much about your lives and work that's really inspiring to me. And Chuck, I want to thank you for your leadership of our public lands. I have never been more encouraged than when you took your seat.
Oh, thank you, Peter.
And to this question of the role of Indigenous sovereignty, I'm a non-Native person. I work with other non-Native people who are supporting the Wabanaki Confederacy. Straight up, we believe that Wabanaki sovereignty is conservation. When we in the non-Native world support Indigenous decision-making over their own lands, we're supporting good conservation, good stewardship of land. And that's also why we choose to return land without it being subject to conservation easements, because those easements say that we do not respect Indigenous decision-making and their caregiving traditions. And, I look forward later on to tell you more about that work.
Thank you, Peter. Elaine?
Thank you, Chuck. Nipmuc Inishwanisha Wanaknai Kushiaputimki, Elaine Harvey, Kowashinash Koltipa. I just want to say good afternoon to each one of you, and I'm thankful to be here on this panel today. As mentioned, I come from the Yakama Nation, one of the 14 tribes and bands that make up the Yakama Nation, which is the Comithla Band of Southern Central Washington. And I currently work for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. This is an intertribal organization. We represent 4 Columbia River Treaty tribes, which include the Yakama Nation, the Warm Springs tribe, the Nez Perce tribe, as well as the Confederate tribes of the Umatilla Reservation. So we do represent and support the 4 tribes in at many different capacities and in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm just thinking about Landback and how Landback is a sensitive issue for our tribes, because um, as you know, through history, through the removal of our tribal people from our ancestral lands to reservations. You know, that's it's been really hard for the Northwest tribes as well, and then for us to keep our traditions and our culture alive. You know, it's been a real struggle, but our our chiefs, you know, in the 1855 era, 1800s, you know, they reserved certain rights for us, and we're real fortunate. And I always think back to the 1855 era and the four tribes that I just mentioned. You know, they're all treaty tribes with the United States government. And I think about our ancestors and our chiefs at that time. You know, they didn't speak English. They could not read or write English. However, they reserved really significant, important rights that we, as descendants, you know, we fish because of those rights. They're reserved rights to fish, hunt, and gather, and then those rights are, you know, get reaffirmed in court. And so now, you know, we are managers of fisheries. We are co-managers with you know, some of the state and federal agencies and co-stewards. You know, these are important in thinking about land back, and if the tribes, if we can get some land back, you know, it would enable us to practice um, gathering, enable us to practice having ceremonies on some of these areas, you know, sacred sites, you know, and so just thinking about, you know, the link to tribal sovereignty and how we were at one time the land stewards of the land, you know, and we believe in our way, our culture. We're the Columbia River tribes, and we're real similar, as Chuck mentioned. You know, we're Sahaptin speaking. We all fish, we all hunt, and we all gather. And you know, that's really part of our life. And we go on the seasonal round yet. You know, we travel many miles to get these different foods throughout the year. And I think, you know, having land back and even just having land trusts allow us access onto some of these conserved lands are key and important because you know, we we as tribes, you know, don't have all the funding and the money to buy land. And so just having a relationship established with the tribes is key so that you know, we can assist with fish restoration, with meadow restoration, you know, and bringing back these natural foods and medicines and the salmon, and and even providing assistance with wildlife, you know, restoration. So you know, just thinking um, at all different realms because everything's connected in our way. We know that water is you know, water is required for all life, but then you know, but everything's connected in our way of thinking, believing, in our ceremonies. All our first foods are connected in some way or another. But you know, just thinking about land back and tribal sovereignty, and you know how important that is to all Native people, I believe. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you, Elaine. So when each of you spoke, you touched on the justice side of it. You each spoke in a way that talked about in your understanding in the work of land back that justice plays an important understanding and the injustice that came because of the loss of land from tribal people and what how that injustice played out to Native people in North America and the work you're doing to recapture that. That being said, my next question to you all is land justice is generally defined as efforts that enable land access, affordable ownership, and decision making by individuals and communities who have traditionally been excluded from owning and stewarding land. How do you see the intersection and perhaps disconnections of this definition in comparison to the indigenous interpretation of the word justice in the work that you do? And I want to start with Peter on this because I know he's worked a lot around this section.
Thank you, Chuck. And of course, I'm not an indigenous person, and I can't give you that perspective on the word justice. But what I can say is that what is just to First Light and the Wabanaki Commission is the return of fee simple title to land, mineral rights, surface rights, land itself, not subject to easements, without cost, and often with the stewardship fund, straight up. That is to us what feels to be just. And while that sets out a high bar, it also respects our understanding of Wabanaki land care. And, I'll speak more about this later, the mechanics of it, because I think we are giving our own non-native colleagues a high calling. Chuck, as you say, all of us are born to do good. If we can make a high calling to our fellow non-natives to do what is just, then many things are possible. And in fact, they are. In Maine right now, we collectively, many organizations are doing the largest return of land in North America, the return of 52,000 acres, 11 separate landscapes to 5 Wabanaki communities, all fee simple title, all without easement, much of it with stewardship funds to address land rematriation. None of that legislated, none of that mandated, all of that done because we do actually want to believe that we were all born to do good.
Thank you, Peter. Tamiko?
Thank you, Peter. I love that. So when I look at how we view it, the very first thing that comes to mind is how it happened. Colonization, stripped our people of the land that they lived on. And in order to perpetuate this continued theft of homelands, the narrative is pushed that we didn't know, like that we either sold it cheaply or we didn't deserve it. We didn't know how to take care of it, or, as colonization grew and grew and grew and grew, and grew, the narrative got bigger and bigger and bigger. It's almost like the Whopper kept getting bigger, bigger and bigger. And if you say something enough, in many cases, people start to believe it. So with that, therein lies one of the biggest hurdles, because sometimes when I hear about rematriation, there's always a hesitancy because folks are worried about, well, can they steward it? Do they have the ecological knowledge to be successful? And this fee simple title is something that you want to see, because it doesn't tell them, oh, you can have it if you understand how to put the salmon back in the river, or you can have it if you understand how to harvest the timber. Like, the fee simple title allows for the nation to act as a nation, to take care of the land that the creator gave them in the first place. So the definition you gave, it didn't quite hit with me, because we first have to get past how the colonizing mindset allows the narrative to grow, which is not in favor of any indigenous sovereign.
Thank you. Elaine?
Yeah, thanks, Chuck, for this next question. And thinking about land justice and just thinking about the history of what happened. And I'm thinking about the hydro systems that came onto the Columbia River and the many tributaries. And we live in a basin with over 200 dams, and we have 18 main stem Columbia River dams. And our people are the Columbia River people. We're salmon people. We're, as I mentioned before, we still live off the land and do our seasonal hunting and gathering. And many of our village sites were located on the Columbia River. And when they built the dams, they totally, they removed many of our people who lived along the river. So we lost many village sites. We lost many burial grounds. We lost one of the biggest Native American fishery in North America, the Celilo Falls. And even today the dams still burden our people. They burden our salmon. They burden the steelhead, the sturgeon, all the fish that we depend on. And even today we're dealing with those impacts of the 18 main stem dams. And those are just the 18 main stem. You're thinking about all the tributaries, the impacts that the hydro system have had. And we just lost so much during that time. And I always think about our elders, who were actually left homeless.
Mm.
The Army Corps came and just said, "You will leave. You're going to get flooded." And many of our people were left uncompensated.
Mm.
And so, I'm thinking about land justice, and stewarding the land is important. But with that removal period of when the dams were built, some of our families are still homeless.
Mm.
We have many Native communities along the Columbia River who are just living at fishing sites, and these are village sites at one time. And, so I'm just thinking about, land justice, it also includes, housing and
Yeah.
having those, housing for our tribal people, because it is not our fault, that some of our relatives, live homeless. And it's really heartbreaking because when the dams were put in, it just became generational almost. And and so I'm just thinking about land justice. It's essential that our tribes do get land back, and the land will be conserved for the future. We're always thinking in the future as Native people. We don't just say 10 years, 20 years. We're thinking 50 years. We're thinking 100 years down the road. We want sustainable river systems for our fish and for the resources. We want our children and grandchildren, those yet unborn, to be able to fish, hunt, and gather as we do. And we got to retain those rights. And land back is one way. And I think, just and us just being outspoken and talking for these resources is important. And one thing I almost feel it's really heartbreaking sometimes to me is in this land, North America, probably even South America, our teachings are, we weren't here. We were not the first species on this land. It was the animals. It was the fish. It was the Pacific lamprey, the oldest fish species that we still have in the Columbia River. It was the birds and the wildlife. And in the way that things are going on in this world, they're in the back burner. They're, it doesn't matter about endangered species sometimes because some of these projects will just go through. I'm seeing like endangered sage grouse, and one of the last stronghold habitats for sage grouse in Washington is going to get, a solar project is going to mow over their habitat, for green energy. So, I'm just seeing and thinking like in our culture and belief, the animals were here first. They have a right as well as us Native people and everybody, the animals, the fish, even the plants, they all have that right to exist on this land. But I feel like sometimes, um, and I feel like some us as Native people, we have to speak up on their behalf because they don't have a voice. But I'm just thinking about land back, land justice, and it kind of goes deep with me. It goes deep, and it's probably because of the traumatic colonization history, manifest destiny. But it's like still happening today. Um, some bad things to our tribes, but and the resources. But I'm just thinking about land justice, and it really goes deep. It kind of goes down. It goes deep. So thanks for the question, Chuck.
Well, thank you, Elaine. So we're going to go into the next phase with about 10 minutes for each of you, if you will, to go a little deeper in the work you do. And I would love to start with you, Elaine, because you're talking about a little bit some of that work that you do. And if you could kind of elaborate on the work that you've been doing for the past several years and talk a little more deeply on the land back and acquisitions you've been working on with Columbia Land Trust, and then in general, as you've seen with the tribes in the Columbia Plateau.
Okay, Chuck. I'm gonna try to. I want to share. I have a few slides, and it's mostly to show kind of like the geographic area I'm talking. Um, it says host disabled participants screen sharing. Can someone let me share?
Zoe or Tegan?
Yes, let me, can you share now? Are you able to?
Oh yeah, okay. I got it. I hope you guys can see my slides. Sometimes it doesn't work when I'm on Zoom.
We see it.
Looks good.
Okay. All right. So share a few slides I have. I work at the mission, and let me see if I can. I'm trying to switch my slide over. Sorry guys, my Zoom restarted for some reason. Is there no slideshow now?
Yeah, it went away.
Okay, maybe I'll just leave it off because I do have issues on this laptop with Zoom for some reason when I'm sharing. But I wanted to share what I wanted to share was we have a cryptic map, and it just shows the reservations of the four tribes that we represent, but it also shows the ceded lands, which our tribes when we had treaties with the U.S. government, we have these geographic boundaries called ceded territories, and within those territories, those are within each four tribes, we retain those exclusive rights, for fishing, hunting, and gathering. And then there's like another bubble, I guess you can call, from the reservation to the ceded lands. Then we have usual and custom. So we have these different geographic areas where we're able to do these things. But we also did cede a lot of land. For instance, like the Yakama Nation ceded 13 million acres, and those are ancestral lands. So each tribe did cede so many thousands or millions of acres. But and through history, there was even within our reservation, through the different allotment acts and stuff, we lost land that was like 100% tribal reservation, and it kind of got opened up for settlement for a certain amount of time, and then we lost land. So just thinking about those things, and then how it's kind of connected to land back and access. Within our treaties, we retain those rights exclusively on public lands. So, like on state lands, on federal lands, and those are important because those also come in with our tribes become co-managers with the federal agencies or the state agencies, and it's really important, especially as the four tribes, that each four tribe is a co-manager in regards to salmon, to the salmon restoration, to some of the funding that we get for mitigation to replenish the salmon, but also wildlife, and and also thinking about protecting the Columbia River tributaries because of the water. Right now, our water situation isn't the healthiest, and so that's one area that we're also. I work in the watershed department, and so kind of working and thinking about all those, um, and then there's all different kind of policies that we have to deal with. We have the Army Corps, we have EPA, we have all these federal agencies we work with to address some of these issues as water health. And then we even have to deal with this Columbia River Treaty, which will also impact our tribes, our salmon, the Columbia River, and the future, the next 50 years. So, just thinking about all these different things that we deal with, and then I've been on the Columbia Land Trust for the past 6 years, a board member, and kind of been really active in educating the land trust, but also the supporters of the land trust, the financial supporters, and educating them about land back, about how, and the Columbia Land Trust has been really good on working with some of the tribes on being bridge buyers to property, and if the tribe can come up with the money later, that's a good opportunity, gives the tribes. But also another thing is, this is right near the reservation, tribal area, to remove it, restoring fish and wildlife habitat. All important because they're supporting fish and wildlife habitat, but also the river. They're restoring the Columbia River for the salmon, juvenile salmon that are going out to the ocean, areas for juvenile salmon and then also for adult salmon coming back. So, the land trust that I work with, Columbia Land Trust, has been really good in developing relationships with the tribes in the area. And also I've been working with the Oregon Land Justice Project and the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. And that's really, kind of doing education. So they work with, a lot of land trusts. And so, bringing in that education to multiple land trusts, is really key, I think, to talk about land back, to talk about tribal access to the lands, and then even how the tribes can assist in restoration work. I know the Blue Mountain Land Trust in Oregon, they work with the Warm Springs, and they did a really a wonderful restoration project of a camas patch, because camas is an important food source for many of the Northwest tribes. But they did a restoration of camas down that way. So, I've been fortunate to be able to be working with land trusts, not just the Columbia Land Trust, but there's also the Columbia Gorge, Friends of the Columbia Gorge Land Trust. And I think it's really important because, any conservation of land is important to me, because I'm just thinking about the land. I'm thinking about conserving it way into the future, and about wildlife, about restoration potential, and even bringing beaver back into the picture as a climate change restoration tool. I think of land and natural solutions to climate change. Personally, that's what I like the idea of natural solutions because we're in a time of climate change right now, and on the west coast, and so I think natural solutions are key, and all this bringing it into working with the land trust. I don't want to go over my time, Chuck. I should have looked at my time. Is
I
it
think
about?
yeah, I think you're doing well. Thank you, Elaine.
All right.
All right, Dr. Jackson.
I'm back. So, as I stated before, I use the word rematriation, and I'd like to just give a little definition of that for some people, because sometimes when I use the word rematriation, someone will say, "Do you mean repatriation?" No, I mean rematriation. Rematriation is a concept and movement primarily championed by Indigenous women, focused on restoring a sacred relationship between Indigenous peoples and their ancestral lands and lifeways, while also honoring matrilineal societies like the Nipmuc and opposing patriarchal violence. It goes beyond simply repatriating land or objects and emphasizes the spiritual, cultural, and gender dimensions of indigenous connections to the earth. Rematriation is a way to reclaim what was taken from Indigenous peoples, including their lands, culture, and spiritual practices, and to rebuild a more just and sustainable future. For us, in rematriating the 500 acres that we received from the W.D. Cowles Land Trust, we're using that to basically like solidify our sovereignty as the Nipmuc nation of people within this area. We're looking for, we have farmers, we have ecologists that we have architects, because we're looking at tiny homes. We want to house our people. As Elaine said, we have people that are homeless because of colonization, right? Because of what they've done to take what was ours. We want to make sure that what we're doing now is an embodiment of what the 7 generations behind us wished for, and for a legacy and a place of belonging to the 7 generations ahead of us. We're looking at, back up. We have a small reservation, we have a farm, and we have the 500 acres. So we're stewarding a couple of different places. And we are very actively looking to, yes, we have an ecologist, but is that person Indigenous? We want people to become educated so they can come fill those spots, right? They can come fill the architecture spots. They can come fill the farmer spots, all those things that we've lost because we've been off of our land for so long. We want to bring that back too. So I'm not going to take 10 minutes because I don't have 10 minutes worth of what we're doing to say about that. But as far as the Hassamanisco Nipmuc Band, the freshwater people of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, we want to rematriate what colonization stole. And I think when we start talking about this narrative, we have to talk about it in that way, because it allows people to understand how unjust it was, how justice was not prevailing, never prevailed. So if the narrative can be corrected and understood, then we would see more nations rematriating more land that belongs to them, with a fee simple title. That's what you said, right? Yeah. Fee simple title, because I hadn't heard that. So that's it for me. If you know any Nipmucs, give them a high five because we're really playing.
I do, and I will.
Thank you. Peter?
Thank you. After listening to Dr. Jackson and Elaine, I have a question for all my non-native brothers and sisters on this webinar, and that is, what is a conservation movement? Who are we as a movement if we prove unwilling or unable to stand behind and alongside our indigenous relatives who have cared for the land long before, our science showed up? We've been asking ourselves that question as non-native leaders of land trusts in Maine. I'm a non-native organizer of that work, and the work is generational. It began long before me, and it's going to go on long after I die. I've been focused hard on it for 10 years or so, so to describe it to you in under 10 minutes is a shallow dive at best, and I really want to challenge you, inspire you, and whet your appetites to learn more. So this thing that we call First Light is many things. First, it is a collaboration, a co-creation between the 5 Wabanaki tribes of Maine and their deliberative body, which is called the Wabanaki Commission, and dozens of land holding groups, many land trusts, who have committed to returning things to them. And I talked to you about that. Some of the things we've been returning, 52,000 acres of rivers and coastlines and forests, all for Wabanaki prosperity. And I'm really saying that to Elaine, because what I heard you say about poverty distresses me and makes me want to challenge my own movement to do better around that. And what we are engaged in is one of the largest land return efforts that you've never heard about because we simply believe it's more important to do the work than to tell the story about it, talk about it. So First Light representing non-native conservation and the Wabanaki Commission representing indigenous communities. We are 2 canoes learning how to paddle together in the same direction. And there's so much work for both worlds to do if land justice is to happen. First Light has brought together a community of 60, 70 or so non-native organizations, many of them land trusts, but also philanthropies, committing to doing relearning of history, recentering of indigenous decision-making, and returning of land and resources. While at the same time, the Wabanaki Commission works in parallel to rekindle a culture of intertribal deliberation and decision-making around land. So forget everything I said about real estate transactions. This work is first and foremost about relationship and trust making between 2 worlds, right? And if we in the non-native world are really to trust our Wabanaki colleagues, we got to believe in their stewardship and their sovereignty. And if that's true, why would we put a conservation easements on the land we're returning? Through slowly trusting one another, we're beginning to share knowledge about how to be in relationship with the lands and waters of the Northeast and how to care for nature much more effectively. So this work that we call First Light is, Chuck, truly a way of being human together again. No project, no transaction, nothing is more important than what we are learning around how to be human beings together. Absolutely, our stories are singular, but our destiny is shared. And so while this is about returning land and money to Wabanaki communities, it's also about transforming us as conservationists by teaching us that land is kin, that our work is about protecting relationships between people and between people and the land, and that philosophy of leave no trace, well, it speaks primarily to our sorrow about our failed relationships. And this work has given all of us involved with First Light the joy of imagining and seeing how to leave a beautiful trace instead through our Wabanaki colleagues. So how did this happen, and what keeps it together? I can only speak from my perspective as a non-native person. The three things that I see out there that have happened that have made the most difference are showing up for one another over and over again. This work requires thousands of hours of meetings and formal and informal conversations and driving long distances to meet face to face. This August, next month, hundreds of us non-natives will be gathering with our Wabanaki colleagues on canoe trips, at tribal community days, in ceremonies, in protest marches, over dining room tables. We are coming together. Friends, land justice is not going to be accomplished through a 90-minute webinar. Second thing is paying people equitably. When we began this work 10 years ago, we knew that Wabanaki people were rarely, if ever, paid to attend meetings, while our land trust folks were making 70 grand salaries and more to attend those same meetings. So we figured out what an average land trust person makes in a day, and then we paid that amount to every Wabanaki person who is generous enough with us to meet with us. And that signaled that we understood how screwed up things had been, or a little bit about how screwed up things have been. And then the third thing is we are trying really hard to take responsibility to change ourselves. We believe that every culture has a responsibility to shift itself. So non-native folks like me in First Light, we're guided by these three verbs: relearn, recenter. That means recenter Wabanaki worldview, and then return. Return things, return to being human. So we relearn the through line of colonization, capitalism, conservation, not just once in a 2-day workshop, but through year-long learning journeys, where we do a deep dive into the history. We all read the treaties. We talk among ourselves about how colonization shows up in our own organizations today as patriarchy, as hoarding of land. We ask ourselves difficult questions like, how much is enough? And I want to say to you that we are not hippy-dippy, do-good organizations at the margins of conservation. We are the new core of conservation. A new movement, large, small, sometimes global organizations with land and great wealth who understand their responsibility to Indigenous people. Our community in Maine controls 24% of the state of Maine. And once we figured that out, we had to ask ourselves, what do we do with that? What do we do with that responsibility? And that brings us to all the things I've been telling you about. And we do not see this work of returning land as mission drift, but as mission maturity. Recentering for us means putting Wabanaki worldview at the center of our work and decentering ourselves so that there is space for two-eyed seeing, which is the philosophy that our Wabanaki colleagues follow, that says that conservation biology is at its best only one view of what nature needs. So our goal, because nature needs this, because our planet needs this, is to bring all the knowledge we collectively have, settler science, Wabanaki science, to do the best care that we can for nature. So when we in the non-native world relearn history, center Wabanaki science, then it becomes really natural and obvious to begin returning land and money, and to do it without restriction, to do it with trust. Some land trusts are contributing preserves that they already own, and many more are contributing significant portions of their budgets to fund this largest land return in North America, while at the same time they're helping to create Wolankitsime, which is a Wabanaki foundation for, Dr. Jackson defined it, land rematriation. What are our motivations in the non-native world to do this? Dozens and dozens of white-led land trusts are in First Light because they yearn for a different future. This land justice work with Wabanaki people brings so much to us as non-native people. We earn a more complete understanding of where we live and our responsibility to that place, and we gain new ways to understand how to care for nature and for one another. And, you know, Chuck, you said it at the very beginning, we are learning how to become more human together. So we're doing this work of First Light because it is the best way we can express our love of this earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. You know, when we look about this and Landback, the major trade that we have to use in modern times, of course, is money. And figuring out how you even gather those funds, whether that's through individual donors and campaigns. And the largest public money, of course, is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And most of those folks who work in the land conservation field know that that money comes from oil and gas revenues that the United States collects from the leases that the United States provides to oil and gas industry, and then goes into a fund that we redistribute out to states on a formulaic basis, and then for projects that go back to help in conservation movement. Which is interesting to me because, of course, you know, the original land stewards and owners, of course, were the tribes, but none of that money actually goes to tribes as of yet. Peter and I have worked for years trying to get portions of that money. And even when I oversaw the fund as the director of the National Park Service, we were running into a lot of issues around just trying to get the land conservation movement to move towards that to ensure there were set-asides to it. So that being said, you know, when I look about some of the issues that I hear, why those funds may not be available, a lot of it still comes back to around the legal tools that are made available that tribes may or may not use when they are stewarding the land. And so we've been fortunate to get a number of questions coming in. And so one of those questions that we have, and I'm going to kind of go in order here while the times allow us, is that when we look at, let's see, go back up, and it was, where did that go? Could the panelists explain the concept of land use planning and sustainable land management in the context of indigenous land? And is there a different context of land management and land use planning?
I'm going to just say that if the land use management, and then what was the second thing you said? The land.
Sustainable land use management.
Okay, the sustainable land use management. Anything that has a title like that for me, if it is a constraint or a colonized opinion of how indigenous folks should handle their rematriation, then I don't know where it fits.
Yeah.
I'm not sure when we start. So it's like when you buy your house or when you get your house and the person who sold your house said you can live here, but you have to do it like this, you're not going to like that. So I'm not, I'm not an expert on this, but that's what I got from that question.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to go back to fee simple title, because to me that sounds very freeing, and that here's your present, please take care of it. So that's how I felt about that. So I hope.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. May I follow on that?
Sure.
I would like to believe, I would rephrase the question to be to say, I believe deeply in Wabanaki care of land. In contemporary times, the most significant natural resource victories in northern New England have been led by indigenous people. I think the land use planning that my culture has produced is nowhere near as caregiving to the land as what I see from my Wabanaki colleagues. And that is why in Maine, we are aligning ourselves very strongly and carefully with our Wabanaki colleagues for their sovereignty and their use of land.
Do you have anything to add, Elaine?
Yeah, I was just trying to think of the question of land use planning, and um I'm just thinking because I'm involved in so much, like, so we have like the Columbia Gorge Commission, and they oversee the Columbia Gorge, which is a national scenic area. But working with them over the years and the four tribes helped them develop a climate change adaptation plan for the Columbia Gorge, looking into the future. And I mean, this is it's not land back, but this is a Gorge Commission who's protecting water, cold water. They're protecting habitats of many types, and then they included us. And this is the first document that I can say in the Northwest that I read where they honored the four treaties of the four tribes, and they honored um, the rights that we have in the Columbia, this area. They honored the fishing rights. They honored the gathering rights, and they even took our recommendations at looking at climate change into the future of how are we going to address and be resilient into the future. And so, I'm thinking about land planning. This is one example of the four tribes and the Gorge Commission reaching out to the tribes, because there's always a hesitancy for like non-native organizations, counties, to reach out to the tribe. But the Gorge Commission reached out to the four tribes, and I'm thankful as part of this, because we're talking about shrub steppe habitat, which is more sagey kind of habitat, ranging all the way to the alpines into the forest lands, and all these different landscapes are important to our people because they provide cold water to the Columbia River, which the salmon need. And so, we're there at the table having tribal people at these types of planning meetings. Right now where I live, they're doing a comprehensive land use plan for the county where I live, and having us there, having the native people there, to bring out some of these important issues because we're in a time of climate change. So we got to plan for climate change. And, that always has to be addressed in all of the plans that are happening. But yeah, I'm just thinking about the question of land planning and having tribes at the table is key. Getting our perspective, our traditional ecological knowledge, or our understanding, or our solutions. Like I mentioned, let's look at natural solutions. We can't just look at, oh yeah, well we need million solar panels, or I mean, we need to look at natural solutions. I'm feeling look more at natural solutions with climate change in regards to climate change. But yeah, I'm just thinking about the question about land planning and land use. But
Thank you. I think folks don't fully realize, if we just look at Western science, and during my time as Director of National Park Service at White Sands in New Mexico, we found tracks that now tell us that what we've known. As my grandfather said, I don't know why they never asked us. We can tell you we've been here at least 30,000 years. Because when I was in grade school, they told me I was here 10,000 years. I told him that. He laughed and said 30. When I graduated high school, they said we were here between 12 and 15,000 years. By the time I graduated college, it was 18. In the early 2000s, you might have been here 20,000 years. And, I wish he was alive today so I can say, you're right, Grandpa. They just should have asked. Science has proven that out. But in that 30,000 time frame, we know that there were at least 4 to 5 major climate change events. Our stories, our history, our understanding, our own manipulation of our known world told us how we adapted and mitigated for that climate change. And those stories still exist. And how do we help and integrate that in an accelerated point now where we're seeing climate change that is, in my opinion, being caused by man and human made. Um, so thanks for saying that. The next question we got was, what can non-Indigenous civil society organizations or groups do to tangibly support Indigenous sovereignty and land back? Who would like to start? Peter?
Sure. I think number one, commit to shifting your own culture, do the relearning that will enable you to meet with Indigenous people more equitably. So there is a lot of pre-work that is necessary to understand histories that we were not taught in school and not taught in college, and that our Indigenous relatives have been living every day. So I would say, number one, non-Native institutions have a responsibility to shift themselves and to learn that history and to center it and take it seriously. And then I think the other thing is to work collectively to return land. So it is not just one organization deciding to do this, because the reality is it's very hard for non-Native organizations to disperse of assets. And when they come together, they can encourage one another. There's more. It's too easy for one organization to say this is too hard and to give up. But if 20 or 30, or in the case of First Light, 70 organizations band together and commit to that relearning and commit to the returning of things, that's what's happening in Oregon with the Oregon Land Justice Project as well. So those two things, I think, are really important for non-Native people to do, to relearn the history and commit to working collectively for land justice.
Great. Dr. Jackson?
I mean, I agree with what Peter says, and just be, I tell everyone, just be honest with yourself, and it's okay to acknowledge that Indigenous people exist and live amongst you and have been here before any of what you see was here. Not every, nobody looks for repatriation to build a casino. And a lot of people are afraid that when we receive land back, that we're going to ruin communities because we're going to bring in that type of business. I know Connecticut, they're so afraid of that because, I think our legislators, they were against giving land because they're just against it because think everyone's going to build a Foxwoods or Mohegan Sun, and that's not true. I think that sovereign nations should be allowed to build an economy, and not everyone's economy is around, gaming. As we see Elaine, their economy is around fishing, salmon. Everyone has their own thing. So be open-minded. Don't drink the Kool-Aid because, it's not always the best thing. And just have conversations. And I think that's one of the most important things, as with any situation, communication is very important.
To put a little context, I thank you, Dr. Jackson, to talk about that. So just if you look at lands in the lower 48, tribes have about 56 million acres of land held in a trust by the federal government that they own and control. In Alaska, it's another 44 million acres. So if you take that 100 million acres, over 90% of those lands are already in some type of natural resource value and use. There, it's not, you can't say that about the rest of the United States. 90% of the land base. 5% of it is in some part of economic value and use, and that may mostly around agriculture, farming activities that may have an economic base. And some may be in gaming, but it's much like less than 1% of their land base is in actual gaming in any type of way. The other 5% is in community use, which means tribal housing, hospitals, community roads, shopping centers, those things that are used by the community in and of itself for its purposes. Um, and I'd like to remind folks that while they're worried about gaming, almost every state in the union already has gaming through lottery. And so it's pervasive around the country. But yet we don't hear a whole lot about that. Instead, where it seems that there's this I don't know, an inaccurate fear about gaming on reservations, and that when tribes get back land, it's instantly going to turn into some gaming operation. Elaine, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think um the two other panelists, Peter and they covered it pretty well.
Here's a really good one. I'm just trying to think of one about this myself, and I might have an example. There's a great question. Are there successful examples of extinguishing existing conservation easements prior to returning fee simple land to indigenous communities?
I can give that a shot. I'm not aware of extinguishing existing easements, but there is a movement afoot for those who believe that conservation easement should go over indigenous land. There's a movement afoot to say that new easements will be extinguished if the fee simple title goes into indigenous stewardship. And I think that's positive, because in a way that's saying I can understand why my culture would not trust itself. And so maybe I can understand why it would put a conservation easement over its own land. But if that land were to ever be returned, then that easement can be extinguished. I think that would aid, that would address the concern, the just concern that many indigenous people have around the call for more conservation, because invariably that conservation, it does include a conservation easement, which ultimately does not respect indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example and where that may have been bought out. I would have to do a little bit more research myself on that. It's one of those things where, there probably is one. I just don't know of one where somebody's been able to buy out an easement, or an easement had a definitive time maybe on it for some reason.
Yes. Well, there's another a good suggestion that is, why would a non-native organization be comfortable enforcing an easement over an indigenous nation? I mean, that feels like a recipe for a bad relationship, right? Why not transfer those easements to indigenous land trusts, who are going to share a world view with that owner? And we're big believers in that, and very excited by the growth of indigenous land trusts in this country. And we do collaborate now with Native Land Conservancy and with other indigenous land trusts, and that is also that as a suggestion for what to do with lands that are governed by conservation easement. Feels like a good one, a good path, a path toward justice and better relationships.
When looking at different types of federal agencies. And Elaine, and I know that you've worked with like the Army Corps of Engineers and many others. Um, where do you see them being helpful in the movement to help with land back in fulfilling their obligations to tribes?
Um, I think it's a little bit. I think, well, the federal agencies that I work with, they're kind of like when that is brought up, they kind of back away. I thought, like, they're like, oh well, we don't want to go there. So last year I was involved with the Northwest um, Forest Plan Amendment, which the amendment was going to cover the entire, practically the Cascade Mountain Range from Canada down to Northern California. And that was one issue that we brought up as tribal members on the committee was, what about land back potential? And but that um didn't go well, or it kind of, there was like hurdles, or there was like a block there. They're like, oh yeah, well, we can't go there, and it's kind of a little bit upsetting. And then in regards to like the Army Corps, um, us 4 Columbia River tribes are pushing the Army Corps. Well, we need replacement homes for the homes that were lost, for the families that were left homeless. And they're like, oh yeah, well, we gotta have, you know, we have to have, I forgot what you call that, clearance through the Army Corps to even proceed with even talking about that, and so there's like, I see a lot of hurdles with the federal agencies when it comes to in regards to land back. And then on the state side, because you got state DNR lands and WFW lands. As I was working at Yakima Nation, I brought up the issue of, okay, if you guys are going to cover this DNR land with solar panels, it's a root gathering ground, and I think you guys need to mitigate and say, give us the same amount of land that has root grounds and put into conservation for, in way into the future for perpetual conservation. But another thing that's happening here in the Northwest is the Nature Conservancy. They are actually giving land back, and it's kind of just a like for free. Um, and I guess you can say free title.
Yeah,
Um,
it is.
there's one example I'm pretty that just happened recently was the Colville tribe. TNC gave the Colville tribe some land back, and they are proposing that because TNC has land that um, they're not on their priority list. So now what they're looking for is like, well, whose ancestral land is this? And they're looking at tribes,
Mhm.
and they want to give land back to the tribes, and it's actually happening right now. And so that's something positive that I see. They're not a federal agency, but they do a lot of good work, and they're conserving land, and they're looking at tribes to potentially, give land back. So, I think that is one good thing that's happening here in the Northwest.
Thank you. Well, we were able to get to almost half the questions that the audience has asked. I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to everybody's question, but we're closing in on our time. So I wanted to give at least each of the panelists a minute to kind of summary of anything you wish to say as we close out. And I would like to start with Dr. Jackson.
Every time I'm like, I hope it doesn't pick me first. um, Communication and the willingness to acknowledge the people that were there before anything you see today. Willing to work with them, willing to search them out, willing to accept them, and if you want to rematriate land, there is a toolkit that can help you that um, the that Yale is putting forth here. Reach out to them if you know it. Reach out because if you don't know how to do something, look for help so that it's done right. Because a lot of times with things like this, when what happens to us is it's done incorrectly, and the people that pay the price is the indigenous nation, right? They'll pay the price because it'll be, you didn't do it right and it may be stripped. So if it's going to happen, just make sure it's done right. There are a lot of resources out there. There are a lot of allies out there, like Peter. Peter is like amazing. Look for people who can help you. That's all I can say. And this was an amazing experience for me. Thank you for welcoming me to the panel and to the people who are signed up for the webinar. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. You bring a perspective that's extremely important about state-recognized tribes. What does that mean? And the idea around matrilineal and what it to rematriate lands back to tribal people in a native nation. Elaine?
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. And I just want to be grateful for having this opportunity to be on this panel and just to share, some of the experiences that I have here in the Northwest and kind of working with, many different agencies, whether they're federal or state and NGOs, and, thinking about I what I always think about is the future, you know. And I'm thinking about the future for our children and those yet unborn because, I want them to have opportunities to do what we do, that we're able to fish for salmon, we're able to go gather roots and berries and medicines and and because it's part of our culture and tradition. And I think just reaching out to the tribes and creating a relationship is key. You can't just expect something to happen and agreements to happen. Like Peter mentioned, it takes time. You got to really like create relationships with the tribes and do your research too. I mean, if you the tribes, um, they have ancestral areas, I guess you can say. So the usual, what we would say, usual custom, or it could be ceded territories, but they're ancestral lands. And so if you want to give land back, or there's an opportunity, it's really good to do some really good research to figure out which tribe, that you're going to work with, because there could be multiple tribes, or kind of want to do your homework. But I really think communication is key, collaboration, and those relationships are important in regards to land back. And it's like I mentioned in the beginning, it's a real sensitive issue. And I've witnessed some land back recently with the Yakama Nation in Springwood, which is in central Washington. And, it was a really happy celebration for the tribe to get. It's not a whole lot of land, but, it was a important piece of land. And, it's going to provide a lot of potential for the tribe to do like restoration work. So, it was happy occasion. But yeah, thanks, Chuck, and my fellow panelists. Really good words, Peter, and all the work that you're doing in Maine, and just say congratulations, and that's inspirational, and I would like to see that more, and across Indian country. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. And I deeply admire the work that you're doing and continue to do, and speaking for those who can't speak for themselves. Peter?
I thank you, Chuck, Elaine, Dr. Jackson, for always being so generous, calling in non-native people to a more hopeful future. I'm really grateful for that. And there is, to my non-native colleagues who are listening, there's a new movement that is building, that is about healing the earth and healing people, and it needs you. So come join it. And thank you so much, Chuck, for pulling us together.
Thank you, Peter. It's always a pleasure working with you and seeing you and spending time with you. For those of you who are fortunate enough, Peter is a also well-known and renowned author, and his words, if you get the chance to read, his words are very inspiring, as you said, Elaine, and bring the ideas of how nature affects us deeply as human beings and why we must have a reciprocal and not a transactional relationship with nature as a whole. I want to thank all of the panelists for agreeing to joining me today and taking the time out of your busy lives to share your knowledge and your experiences, your triumphs and your challenges around land back and land justice. And I'll turn this now over to Tegan and remind everybody that all of the all the links that we have today are actually part of the toolkit and are out there. And so we'll make sure this information continues to be available as we continue to find better and new ways to work with Native people in the land back movement so that we can actually also expand and change the laws that are more just and equitable as we continue to build a more perfect nation. And thank you all. Tegan, Zoe?
Sorry, my computer was not going off on mute. I just thank you so much, Chuck. I will pass it to Zoe to close, but I appreciate the acknowledgement of me today, but I want to be so clear that there was an amazing team of people that worked on this land justice toolkit. I was one of many, and I dropped them all in the chat. Reggie St. Fort Collin, Kristen, Katie Michaels, many other folks. So this was an amazing team effort together with Aspetuck Land Trust and Yale Center for Environmental Justice and dozens of community partners. And so grateful to all of you for the really insightful and heart and land connected conversation that you had with us today. And I'm going to pass it to Zoe to close us out.
Thank you, Tegan, and thank you, Chuck, for moderating so beautifully, and to all of our panelists for sharing insight. This was such a wonderful and powerful conversation. And to all those of you who attended, this was recorded and will be sent to your email as well as posted on the YCEJ website. And we hope that you keep up with news and information and reach out at any point if you have any questions. And we're so glad that you could join us. And for more information at any point, visit ycej.yale.edu and follow us on social media. Thank you so, so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon and this weekend.
Thank you so much.
Bye now.
Bye. Thank you so much, Elaine.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Tegan.
Zoe.